Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves, and folks, about talking about a subject that we've covered on the podcast since its inception almost a decade ago, but it really beggars belief that we're still talking about the same things 10 years later, because there's always great sound bites, there's always this great noise, there's always these great ideas about doing something, and truly Ireland would be world class if there was a league table for countries that says at some point in the future we're going to be world class at something, because that's what we would be number one at. But before I do, I hope you'll allow me to indulge myself for a few moments in how great my sister was yesterday. As you know, my family had a bereavement before Christmas, and we. It was a very tough time, but yesterday she raised over €15,500 for Féileacáin, who help families who have gone through the most heartbreaking circumstances of losing a baby, and to raise €15,500 in honor of our Teddy, because Teddy was her son, her second son, and as she said herself, some things cannot be fixed; they can only be carried. And yesterday she carried herself with great dignity, and that was incredible work. And thanks to everybody who donated. It means the world to her, myself, and all of my family. So I really appreciate it. Anyway, before I get emotional, let's get angry. I'm delighted to be rejoined on the podcast by, I think he described himself, Joan, it's fair to say, as that chancer, disability advocate, trucker cap enthusiast, Bernard Mulvany. Bernard, it's rare to see you without the hat. And head of advocacy with the Irish Wheelchair Association, Joan Carthy. Joan, it's great to see you. How are you keeping this fine, miserable bank holiday Monday morning?
Not too bad at all. Missing the bit of sun, have to say.
Yeah. Oh, please come back soon, Joan, I want to start with you because I mentioned before we came on air the cognitive dissonance. There was an article that struck me only about a week ago whereby the government were talking about Jim O'Callaghan's new stance on Ukrainians who have come here fleeing the war of Russia's illegal invasion, and the need for them to have an income of over €29,500. And so they had to be dependent or independent on the state in order to continue to live here, reside here, and avail of the services. And it struck me immediately that came within days of Micheál Martin saying it's complicated around the disability, the cost of a disability payment, and the actual paltry amount of money that we pay people, whether it be the disability pension, the carers allowance, or some other form of top up on in the plethora of social welfare payments that they have. By the way, I should stop saying social welfare; it's social protection. It's not. We need to not use that language anymore. But Joan, how do you feel when you see those two stories in stark contrast within a couple of days of one another?
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating, and I suppose it really angers and hurts people with disabilities. The government talks an awful lot about disability and what they're doing, and the fact that last year we got an uplift in money for disability services, and we're the winners of last year's budget. That's the type of language that's being spoken. People with disabilities on the ground do not feel like as if they're winners by any stretch of the imagination. There's definitely, I suppose, all budgets have started from such a low place that any uplift, while it's been marked by the government as being, as I said, a winner, that we did really well last year, is only bringing it up slightly. It's still not nearly enough money. And again, it's only in services which are very much needed, but at the same time, it's not putting money in people's pockets. And I think what we've heard before, like we keep hearing different amounts of money being given to different groupings of people. And if you go back as far as COVID, 350 is the figure that was given out at that stage as being what they considered as being a living wage. And yet people with disabilities are now, along with other people in social protection, are only at 254. And still in all of that time, they've never taken into account the real cost of disability. And when they gave the once-off payments, they've taken it away without anything in place. So, anger, frustration, worry, concern, the list goes on of the way people are feeling at the moment.
I'm so glad because the numbers are really important. Go back to COVID and when everybody's told, I'm sorry, you can't go to work because we're shutting down things, and the minimum payment we're going to give you is $350, and at the time that was still like the disability pension and these payments that were being paid to people was significantly less than that. Not only is it significantly less than that, the cost of trying to of being a person with disability, there's an additional cost to that as well in terms of what's accrued. Like, so it should be beyond the 350. And now we see that when it comes to the Ukrainian amount, that the threshold they have to clear is effectively over €540 net every week, a minimum. To kind of, they're I think it actually it tallies out somewhere like a net income of £2,470 because I went in and did an income tax calculator with it. So that should be, if that's what they're telling as the threshold of a, and I'm sorry if this is clumsy language, John, but if that's the threshold for an able-bodied person, the cost for a person who has a disability is much higher. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean the figures that come out for what it costs a person with a disability as an extra. I mean, when they originally did the report, they were talking between 8.5 and 11.5 thousand euro, and that was back in 2021. And we all know how much the cost of living has gone up since then. So for people with disabilities, there's that extra cost again. And I mean, the figure is kind of sitting in and around kind of, 2, 3, 400 euro extra every week for people with disabilities. Now, obviously, that's not every person with a disability. There is kind of that piece where some people need much more than others, depending on their actual physical need.
Yeah, Bernard, I'm going to come to you, and apologies for being a bit flippant earlier. You are, despite everything, all that grief I give you, you're a fantastic advocate for people with disabilities and for the carers community. So there you go. You got an apology out of me for the first time in 10 years. But I just wanted, I want to correct myself as well. By the way, I said the weekly net pay that the government are now requiring a Ukrainian who comes here is €518. Bernard, in terms of carers, tell me, I'm assuming you're getting over €518 every in terms of the. I'm sorry to be so blunt, but these numbers matter. How do you feel when I say that to you? That's what they've set the threshold at, and there you are, talking about being €1,400 worse off than this time last year because of the cost of living crisis that never went away for the disabled and caring community, by the way.
Never went away, Tony. Never went away. And not only that, like, it's all there. The data is there. Like, I mean, if you're caring for one child, family with a carer in that family on the top rate of 300 or €272, you're down now actually €1,820 on the emergency payments that they put in place a year previous. The big thing that, and I still can't get my head around how people are screaming about this, but there is an ERSI report on the cost of disability from last year. And they came out and they said that the Endicon report that the government had gone with underestimated the cost of disability by 50%. They said the report estimates that the cost of disability is 25 to 29,000 euro per year to a household with a person with a disability additional. That sort of now marries up with what the Justice Minister is saying about, if you want to stay in this country as Ukraine, you need to be earning 29.
Yeah, it's almost, the net figure on that, by the way, is 26,900. So it's almost like for like,
there you
isn't
go.
it?
29,000, which is a weekly additional cost of 488 to 555. That is an official report from the ERSI that sat there since last year, totally discounted, along with the Endicon report from 2021. And we're doing this new consultation process, which is a 6-week CTR plans consultation. Like, who did the consultation in 6 weeks? This is government, which now, and we have to be honest about this, they've put it back to the community. They've said to us, how much should we get? And a little proviso in the piece of paper that was circulated to us all, a little proviso: be mindful on who you believe should get this money, because the more people who are entitled, the less it'll be per week. Okay, so there you go. So we now know there's a figure. There's a figure there. They're telling you who wants a slice, who's entitled to it, and you're going to make the decision. Like Joan and is very articulate, and I understand the reason why in her position, and it's really, really important. Me, on the other hand, is not, and I'm sick and tired of this gaslighting from government, and that's what it is now at this stage. It's utter gaslighting.
Yeah,
every single time.
I need to push in, Bernard, because you've, and I will come to Joan on this, because Joan, it's not so long ago that we talked about the white paper on disability and how they were, and the idea that was going to happen around the worthiness of people who are receiving these payments and the hierarchy of disability. And yet, in the run up to an election, the promises that were made, sun, moon, and stars, only a couple of years ago, plus getting rid of the means test for carers allowance and all of that has been long fingered. And here we are again, which, and my words, not yours, Joan. It does sound very much like an almost. It's not the white paper, but we're putting the onus on the disabled community to create this themselves. Am I kicking the hornet's nest, or am I onto something here?
No, I think a big part of the problem is that with the initial green paper, I suppose.
Sorry, the green paper, yeah.
Yeah, no, you're fine. But with the green paper, it was, I suppose, it was constructed within the department with no consultation, and they came out and absolutely rightly so were lambasted in relation to it. So on one hand, there's a bit of fear of getting it wrong again, but the other side of it is that they keep coming back to the community, or parts of the community, and putting it to us to say, what is it you want? But at the same time, orchestrating it, I think, to kind of push answers into a particular box. We're constantly hearing that there isn't a consensus between people with disabilities. So it's very difficult for them to actually come up with a response that will suit everybody. All the organisations and the DPOs, they're talking to each other. And there is very little difference in what people are saying. Most organisations and DPOs are saying exactly the same thing. You may not get 100% consensus, but whoever does in anything that you're trying to put forward. But there is definitely a consensus in relation to what people's needs are, what the payment should look like. There's a fairly reasonable consensus around the amount, but that is going to differ. But I think a big part of the problem with the summit that they held was they had over 1,000 submissions put in from organisations, DPOs, people with disabilities, family members. And I think the hope from the summit was that they would have been able to come up with 3 or 4 possible solutions for discussion on the day. But really what the summit ended up being was the same thing as the submission. It was really trying to push people into agreeing to what the department wanted us to agree to, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think there was, I think a lot of people felt kind of quite let down after the summit, really not kind of knowing what the next step was. And the worry is that out of that, while we keep hearing that it's going to be very, very difficult, that something is going to be thrown in because they feel they've been pushed because they dropped the ball and didn't kind of leave some sort of once-off payment in the budget this year, left people and have been, I suppose it has been highlighted so much over the last year that they have left people with disabilities completely stranded. Because this summit wasn't supposed to happen till next year. So, in relation to the action plan for the human rights strategy for disabled people, this summit was supposed to happen next year. They pulled it forward, I think, because of the pressure. So I suppose that's a little win on our side. But at the same time, we've no idea really what's coming down the road. We're still kind of, we're still trying to figure out things.
And Bernard, I will come to you, but I just want to remind listeners that, Ireland was the last country to ratify the rights of people with disabilities in the UN convention, because effectively we signed up to it, but we didn't want to ratify a part of it, because then it would mean that they could try and attest their rights in courts and say that the states are failing to provide these things. And here we are again in situations time and time again where, it's the same communities left behind. It's the traveller community, it's the people with disabilities community, it's the carer community. In fact, we spoke recently on this podcast about people who work in the professionalised, and I use those words in inverted commas, caring community, who are, on effectively crappy contracts because it's treated as a three-tier system in many ways. Bernard, Joan said she felt frustrated. I know you attended the summit lastminute.com. I don't think you got an invitation until the day before. Tell me your experience of that.
Look, we need to be really honest again. The summit was a PR stunt, and it was politicians coming out on stage. Like, there was no engagement with the audience. There was little breakout rooms that were farmed out on different topics. But this was, and you know what it reminded me of? It really did now, was, and I hate bringing it back to this, but the care referendum, okay? The care referendum was a rushed referendum. And that's coming from civil servants who were involved in all that process. They said that the legislation wasn't robust, the wording was terrible, but government wanted a win. So they pushed out that care referendum, even though it was flagged. Again, like, we have all the reports there. And as Joan has just highlighted again, this summit was brought forward. And it really was. It was just, it was, I don't even, could you call it a summit? It was a series of statements. And at the end of it, nobody was any clearer on what exactly we were there for and what was going to happen next. Nobody knows. And what it feels like is that, yes, as Joan said, government have dropped the ball on this. There was a huge pressure put on government from the general election, the few instances that happened, scrap the Green Paper Coalition, all the different bits and pieces that came in, the fact that, the PUP was 350, we highlighted that from the beginning. Why isn't everyone getting that? Blah, blah, blah. And so it's very hard to actually counter all the narratives that are at play, because we're not asking for anything unreasonable. We're just asking for the minimum sort of needed to survive, to be able to get on with life in a sort of a dignified manner. And government are under pressure from that. So it's all quickly, it's reactive. Let's do a nice PR press event. We'll show the wider community who aren't really impacted by the issues that we are facing daily, that we are trying to do something and we are being proactive. And it's sort of spin. But the community's seen through it all now and they're really angry. I couldn't believe, actually, at my breakout table, there was young academics there who are doing doctorates. They live with disabilities. And they were so angry. Like, these are very clever people who are working in this sphere. And they are saying, we've enough of this. And I turned at one stage, there was one young woman there, she's fantastic, and an amazing speaker, lives her life with a disability. And she turned to Darragh Cleary and she said to him, she says, what do you need from us? Like, literally, do we have to prostrate ourselves in poverty before? And he was so uncomfortable with her saying that, because it's the truth. And I said to myself, that was the summit for me. That was perfect, but in the sense that she got a chance to articulate in that small little breakout table. But outside of that, the rest was all just nonsense. And I hate saying it, but it's the truth. It is the Achilles heel of this government. It has been for a long, long time.
Joan, I'm sorry. I don't know if you remember this, but between Simon Coveney and Owen Murphy, they used to have a housing summit, an emergency housing summit every few months, because homelessness was getting worse. And I think in one particular year that they produced more housing summits than they built actual affordable homes in Dublin Central. So that'll show you. But let's. What are the? You said, Joan, earlier that can we agree three or four principal things? What do you think they should, those, I'm going to call it, for the want of a better term, the things that are, there is a broad consensus on. What are they, and what are the blockers then?
Well, I suppose the broad consensus is that everybody with a disability should get a payment. So, that's what people are looking at. If there's going to be a tiered system, it needs to be based on people's needs. So the tiered system would come in after a universal payment for people with disabilities. And then those who need more, then, that's kind of looked at separately. We have to make sure when we talk about all people with disabilities, we're talking about people who are over 65, who are usually moved on to the old age pension, and they lose all sorts of disability services and payments. So we have to make sure they're included. And we also have to make sure people who are in employment are included. And that can be through maybe a tax incentive. Although a lot of people with disabilities are on very low income. So we'd have to be really careful on how that would work for them. And I suppose the other side of it is just making sure that it's based on people's needs and not on their means. So that's kind of the number one piece. And then after that, we have to make sure that it doesn't become, I suppose, like the special needs assessment. They get so bogged down in assessments that people don't ever actually get the services. And we would worry that would happen in relation to a cost of disability. So I think there needs to become, the department needs to start trusting people with disabilities and trusting their system. So a self-assessment, or at the very least, a letter from a GP as opposed to a consultant letter, which all costs big money to be able to get it in the first place. So I think that whole kind of self-assessment and self-recognition is hugely important. I think most people would be in agreement with that. Look, we get that that in the last census, it says that there's 1.1 million people who are now living with a disability. So it is a big number. But I think every time we talk about it, or the department talks to us about it, it's always about there's only a certain amount of money. So they straight away cap it. And then in the same time, we're hearing all over the news that there's money being given out left, right, and centre. And I go back to the emergency payment that we've been pushing for since last year's budget came out. We've been pushing for that €400, which was the disability grant that was given in the last couple of previous budgets. We've been pushing for that. That's €145 million for people with disabilities out of the budget. That is a drop in the ocean when you think of the amount of money that is being handed out for all sorts of other things. And we're constantly being told there's no money, but yet 145 million would have sorted this out. And again, for people with disabilities, it wouldn't have sorted out all their bills, but it absolutely would have taken the real pinch, the real hurt out of what had happened. And the government have spent so much time on refusing that payment, constantly pushing it down the road to this permanent payment, thinking that people with disabilities have nothing better to do, only wait for next year's budget. But in actual fact, and I think they were pushing that once we saw the sun, the emergency wouldn't be an emergency anymore. People with disabilities are still cold. The weather's after getting bad again. The bills have increased exponentially over the last 12 months. People with disabilities are going further and further into debt.
And the cost of living crisis is we've got almost the majority of households now are in some form of arrears on utility bills, be it gas or electricity. We're talking in 800,000 levels of the 1.4 households that sit somewhere in that window, depending on how they classify, and they do reclassify arrears, by the way, folks. Just to, you can cut these numbers, but people with disabilities, as you say, they require more supports, because especially if you are to a level where you need to keep it warm, you need to keep certain areas that are comfortable. And just to put it again back to the numbers, but I hate to be so blunt about it. A decade ago, our overall tax take was a record of 47.95 billion. Okay. In last year's figures, it was 157 billion. So that's gone up nearly 3.75, nearly 4 times in the growth. Now, Joan and Bernard, I can tell you, when back then people were agitating for what needs to be done. I remember Tom Clonan came on this podcast and said to me that society disables his son more than his son's actual disability, because inability to get it to do things. It strikes me that there is money. There's money for all sorts of things. There's money for data centers that we're paying for. That we're looking at our electricity prices going up again in the end of the summer by between 8 and 18%. There's money. There's money for all sorts of things. Bernard, how does it feel to then go again to a new minister and be told, oh, get a lot of sympathy, empathy, and cup of tea, but that seems to be as far as it goes when it comes to actual action.
You see, again, I'm going to bring it back to just it blows my mind that we can be told in meetings, and fairly politely, that we have to keep focused on the cost of disability, the long-term payment. If we give temporary supports, it opens up some sort of a floodgate of some sort. And then you receive letters and correspondence from different departments, including the Department of the Taoiseach, and stating out why that policy is the way it is. And then 4 weeks later, tractors roll into O'Connell Street, and government absolutely big U-turn, absolutely clamoring, drowning in bad press and PR, pulls 778 million out of the hat and says, right, we're going to make these supports. We now understand your situation, blah, blah, blah. And you're sitting there going, hang on a minute. So we've been at this now since the last budget, highlighting the issues. We're told consistently that we feel your pain, that our inboxes as TDs are full of letters for emails from carers and people with disabilities saying, we're struggling terribly. The energy costs are increasing. Like the bills coming in this house are just nuts. And like the relief that was there was just relief. That's what it was. It just means you were able to meet them. Now you're having to cut back on plenty of other things to try and meet those costs. And government is still, for some reason, it's like they go blank. It's when it's mentioned. It's all of a sudden this just, and they just look into the sky, and it's really, really, it's sort of sickening now at this stage, because the stories are real. I mean, and I'll always go back to Michael Meir, a young man, and saying that he had to make that decision whether he was going to heat or eat. So I go to the food bank twice a week, and that's where I get my food. That way then I can turn the heating on in the house. I mean, like, am I right to say this? But in a civilized society, is that acceptable? No, it's not.
Not only a civilized society, and again, I'm using air quotes, but in the richest country in the world by many metrics.
You go. Is it a case now that they've said no so much now that they can't be seen now to bend to this group? I don't understand that. It makes no sense to me. We've articulated that in meetings, that we believe that this would be a really positive move by government. It would be a very good story, and government to say, we listened, we understand, we want to make available this 148 million as an emergency support for the community to help them over this really difficult time before we go into our full cost of disability recurring embedded payment that we've done all the detail on. And why, as Joan said, not everyone will be happy with the figure, but the majority will be. And we're like, surely that's put your political hat on. But still,
that's the way Bernard describes it, and it's, if you're in an emergency, you need emergency action, and then you use that emergency relief to get you to a period where you can build something more sustainable. But here we are now having this conversation. How do you feel about the idea that, like Bernard said, you see the fuel protests, you see bailouts, you see, we can all point to bike sheds and children's hospitals, and like, I was shocked, and I don't expect anybody to comment on this, but I was shocked listening to Kevin Backhurst try to correct people at the committee recently in the Oireachtas, saying that the 725 million for RT was not a bailout. He said, you should please stop referring to it as a bailout. And I thought, well, it is actually the definition of a bailout, because Kevin Backhurst said himself that RT would be insolvent overnight. Therefore, if the funds are required, it's an emergency relief payment, it's a bailout. We're looking for a bailout for our own citizens. So I know you want to be more, maybe more careful in how you say this, but how do you feel when you see those things as someone who is not just an advocate, but someone who's lived the life of a disabled person, and seeing that. And I'm frustrated. You must be mad.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we're constantly hearing it, and there's a history, I suppose, of people with disabilities being left behind, in relation to budgets and bailouts. And even when we go back many years, to the crash. I mean, people with disabilities were the ones that were hit the most. And when the country started to recover, and there was money put into other spaces. It wasn't put into disability services. It wasn't put in to the like, even for the people who work in the services, which you spoke about earlier. Um, when I suppose when the wage increases were brought back in relation to the Haddington Road Agreement, and the different agreements that were there, it wasn't put in for people who work in Section 39s, which are voluntary organisations. And there has been a major fight in that space within the WRC to get agreements actually bring up the wages of Section 39s, to some level of pay parity. We're still not there. We're still waiting for funding to come through. There's still issues going around that. So people with disabilities and the services that are there have always been the group that have suffered, when things go bad in the country, and then have also been left behind when things improve. And as you said, like, we're one of, if not the richest country in the world. On one hand, the government pat themselves on the back and say how much money we have in surplus, and at the same time, we can't give people €400 to just take them, not even out of poverty by any stretch of the imagination, but give them a little bit of a breather.
Yeah, we have this, it's finally, it's quite funny, and I don't know, and I mean that in the dark sense of humour way. It's funny because we've been talking on this podcast about sort of the subsidy model that Ireland has been built on, because again, the fuel crisis is a perfect example of that. They just throw money at it when it escalates to a level where they can't deal with it. We won't build the infrastructure that means that if you don't have to book in advance every time you want to get a train if you're a person in a wheelchair user. We won't build those infrastructure. We won't invest in those things that will then actually, and I hate to be so economical about it, but will then actually empower people to become, in the words of our former Taoiseach, productive economic units, because they do think of people, sadly, some of the people in government departments think of in those terms. Bernard, I'm going to bring this to a close, but before we do, just a couple of things I'd like you to sort of touch on. The public support for this. Joan is right. We're heading into the summer. People are kind of going, oh, well, it felt bad in the winter. We've had a good run of it. Where is it in terms of campaigning and advocacy, and how can people actually, what would you call them? Because if there's a million people, as Joan said in the census, therefore most households are affected or know someone who is affected. Surely we should have such more social solidarity than we seem to have.
Yeah, I always find that one really interesting. And I remember back when we first started our campaign, and Sean and myself, we coined that phrase, the uncomfortable truth. And you see, there is it's a strange unease amongst, say, the wider population when you're discussing disabilities, whether they mightn't, have a link to it or quietly understand it. They know it's there, and they know families live in their lives. There's the paternal type of affection, that they look at you and they go like, oh, you're doing a great job, fair play to you. But in the back mind, they're thinking, Jesus, thank God that's not me. And so out of sight, out of mind. And something, it takes time to come to terms with that. I mean, when disability comes into your life, you can be quite angry for a while, and then you have to realise, that's, you learn to deal with that and you get on with it. And some people sometimes say things. So on the broader sort of space, you're looking at the wider community. They more so now. Tom Clonan will always articulate that. Definitely more so now than they did 10 years ago. People are very aware about the issues that are there. They when government do the type of event they did just recently, which was wall-to-wall media all that day, they weren't talking to anybody with disabilities, they were talking to Taoiseach, Taoiseach, ministers. And it's projected as we're doing something. And so people go, okay, that's been sort of looked after now. They're in the process there, they're going to sort it out. And so they're less inclined to sort of amplify the anger that's in the community. But it is something that society has become very aware of. And I don't think you can in any way, I mean, I think things like the school places, that issue has really, again, driven to the fore the issue around the way people with disabilities are sort of looked at in Irish society, which is very paternal. But, you know, these are families who can't get a school place. These are, you know, they work very hard. Everyone is very educated now. And so they're kind of saying, no, this is not good enough. We're able to follow the money trail. And we're sort of saying, what's going on? You're telling us this, and this is happening. And even on that money trail, I mean, last year, it was the Minister for Disability was on Drive Time and was talking about, you know, the 638 million that was given to disability sector. But the Disability Federation and ourselves had said that's only meeting the already huge demand, and it's only meeting 10% of the community. And when that was put to the minister, her whole argument disappeared. It just fell away because she knew I'm caught here now. That 600, it was only reinforcing. You meet so many people, they access no services, respite's non-existent. So you're sort of saying to yourself, look, can we just put some money into people's pockets and give them a little bit of dignity for, you know, no, like what everybody else is looking for. And I think more and more now, because the likes of ourselves and IWA and DFI, and we've all started to come together now. This is sort of something that's slightly unheard of. You know, the DPOs and particularly young people with disabilities are kind of going, hang on a second now, you know, we've a voice here, so let's use that. And I'm not bigging myself up, but I've become very aware that the voice front and centre has to be the young person with the disability. So, or the older person with the disability. That's the voice that needs to be heard. And we have to build a platform to get to that. We have to do that collectively, and then, you know, step back and allow that voice to be very much to the fore. That's when, you know, that's when you drive the message home, when the person who it really affects is there, speaking to the camera and telling the community. And now people have started to say, oh no, I have a voice, I'm going to do that. They are front and centre, and people can't ignore that anymore. And a lot of the time I get people who would have no dealings with the sphere, some people who would be the complete opposite of my politics, and they'd say, you know something, we looked into what you were saying, and we're actually disgusted that this country, which is so wealthy and generates so much revenue, that there's a whole cohort that are being utterly failed. And it's not acceptable anymore. So that's a positive. That's coming out of it.
Let's see.
No.
I need to
listen to.
I know, but like, I mean, you touched on something really important in terms of, and I mean this, and this is a criticism of media savviness. A minister will come out and say, look, we've an additional 150 million for X, Y, and Z. And two questions down will actually say, well, that doesn't even bring you back to parity, say, where the last decade was, you know, where we were pre-crash. So, you know, so we just need to be more aware of what we're saying, because we're like with the pay issue around Section 39, people have lost over a decade. And you mentioned the paternalism of it. That's because there's an element of when they say well, you'll be letting down the people you care for. You know, it's as if it's it's a vocational need. And I'm going to finish with this, Joan, to you. Bernard just spoke about the voices and that, but I put it to you, Joan, that awareness is not enough. We should be done with awareness. We shouldn't have any more. We shouldn't need you people going outside the door banging all the time. Awareness is not enough. Where to next, Joan?
Well, look, we absolutely need action. We need action from the government, and we need it now. And that's back to the €400 emergency payments that we've been calling for. We need that action. We need to have. We constantly need people's support, and I think something that that was put to us during our campaign was that if people with disabilities are really struggling, they can go to the social welfare officer and look for the they look for the special assistant payments from there. Part of the problem is, which is something that we've been bringing across all the time, people with disabilities have issues being able to get out of their home because of transport, because of lack of PA services, and certainly couldn't do it in the middle of winter when it's, pouring down and it's freezing cold and they're cold as it is. And I think that again was very disingenuous of the government. They're saying they're not seeing a need that we're talking about because the people aren't turning up and looking for the money. And people with disabilities can't turn up in these places looking for the money. And it doesn't happen the way it used to happen. There's long application forms. You have to prove to the nth penny that you can't afford your bill. So there's all of those issues. So we really, really need action now. We're not going away. People with disabilities will continue this campaign. We will keep pushing, but we do need everybody else's support because it is so difficult for people with disabilities to get out on the streets because of all of the reasons I've just spoken about. So we really do need the support of the whole community to really push this and to nail it.
Joan Carthy and Bernard Mulvany, thank you so much for talking to me this morning, taking time out of our bank holiday Monday to have this conversation. I really appreciate it. We have other podcasts coming your way this week. Obviously, we're going to go back to Gaza, and we have a few other things that we'll be talking about. But I would urge people, I'll put a couple of links at the bottom for Joan's organisation and Bernard's. Maybe click, maybe see if there's a way that you can get involved and support, because we need to move to action, and actually we need to move far beyond action. We need to change things in this wealthy, rolling in the money country of ours. We'll talk to you all very, very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Tony and Martin and Tony, speaking to interesting people only. It's the Echo Chamber podcast. Subscribe now on Patreon.